This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 661 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. As you all know, this is a solo podcast. The majority of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast episodes are just me behind a microphone talking about some topic and giving fantasy football takes. I keep things tightly edited and to the point, so you can just get in and out very quickly while getting bombarded with fantasy football information. That's the goal. To just crush you guys with info. But I know that you probably get sick and tired of hearing just my takes sometimes. You probably want a little variety. So I'm trying something new this year. Every season I do this Players to Target episode, where I talk through 10 or so players that I'm targeting in fantasy football drafts. Then the following week, I talk about players I'm avoiding. I've been doing this for years. This year, I'm going to do that exact same thing, but with guests. Today's guest is a good friend of mine and one of the sharpest fantasy football analysts on the planet. It makes sense that he writes and does work for Sharp Football Analysis. It's my pal, Hribar. Rich has been a guest on here in the past, and you know he brings the heat. We each talk through 5 players that we're targeting in fantasy football drafts this year. Instead of me just asking all the questions, this episode is set up like a conversation. Like more of a typical podcast. But I think it's the right kind of topic to have that sort of environment. Now, before getting to the players to target, I want to remind you about the Establish the Run draft kit. Establish Run has rankings for any fantasy format you may be playing in, and they continuously update as news breaks. You also get access to Evan Silva's top 150, and along with it, a change log that you can read to see why players are moving up and down his draft board. It's a great way to make sure that you understand why players are being ranked where they are. The goal is to help you make better decisions, not tell you who to pick. And if you're into best ball drafting, their strategy, rankings, and insight can help you out a ton with roster construction. I know that I've learned a lot from their analysis myself. Established Run gives you a different perspective on fantasy football than I do. I think the combination of my work and theirs can help make this draft season a successful one. So head over to EstablishTheRun.com and purchase their draft kit. And when you do, use promo code JJ for a 10% discount. That's promo code JJ. Also, don't forget to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 into your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. Be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Now here's me and Rich talking about players that we're targeting in 2022 fantasy drafts. So Rich, things are pretty basic here. What we're going to do is we each have 5 players that don't overlap either, even though we might agree on a lot of these guys. But we have 5 players that we will talk through who we are targeting in fantasy drafts this year. This is based obviously on ADP and where they generally go. And we have players who sort of range from the beginning of the draft all the way to the end of the draft. Let's have you kick things off, Rich. Who is the first player that you're targeting?
Well, since you are the late round quarterback still by name, I mean, I'll start with the kind of quarterback I'm targeting. And you know, if you've read the late round QB fantasy guide, I mean, we still don't want to be the first to the room. We don't want to rush to the quarterback room still. Late round quarterbacks shifted the last couple of years because we've been pretty lucky at navigating the system or really good at it, depending how you want to interpret that. So we want to go like late round QB1. So, I mean, to me, the most palatable guy at ADP right now that I've been getting the most often is Russell Wilson. You look at Russell Wilson last year, kind of left a lot of people wondering, like, are his days of an elite fantasy quarterback over? You know, he missed games for the first time in his career. He had just one top 6 scoring week on the season too. But when you go under the hood, definitely still a lot of positives for Russell Wilson. He had a 6.3% touchdown rate. That's his 5th straight season with a touchdown rate over 6%. That led to him being kind of, 4th in the league in passing points per attempt. Only Aaron Rodgers, Joe Burrow, and Matthew Stafford had more passing points per attempt than Russell Wilson. And obviously he's not going to be on an offense that's going to run the fewest plays in the NFL anymore, which is, definitely a positive. And you look at Denver too, immediate offensive line upgrade. He goes from a Seattle team that was 30th in pressure rate allowed to the Broncos were 16th in ESPN's pass block win rate. So, I mean, he's going to absolutely go from a bottom dwelling offensive line to a solid offensive line, which is going to make a massive difference. And although the Denver doesn't have a top heavy talent like DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett. The wide receiver room, the tight end room, and the running back room paired from receiving stance is a lot deeper than what he had in Seattle. He also has, at Sharp Football Analysis, our top-ranked passing schedule for the 2022 season. I mean, the first month absolutely looks glorious. He starts, with a revenge game immediately narrative at Seattle. Then he has Houston, the 49ers, who he's familiar with, and the Raiders. He also gets the Jags and Jets prior to his Week 9 bye. In the fantasy playoffs, the money zone, weeks 14 through 18, Chiefs, Cardinals, Rams, Chiefs again. That's major firework potential back and forth games. And you look at him against bottom 10 pass defense even last year when people were kind of out on him. He averaged 8.4 yards per pass attempt, 2.3 passing touchdowns per game against those teams, opposed to 6.9 yards per pass attempt and 1.7 passing scores per game against those non-bottom dwelling teams. The one thing with Russell Wilson, what's hard to vault him into like that top 6 tier, is that turning 34, how much of the rushing can we really kind of count on? Last year was the lowest rushing production we had of his career. And can we really kind of vault him over a Jalen Hurts? Probably not, but he's the first guy I start to monitor, like when those elite quarterbacks start to come off the board.
Yeah, the other thing too, if you're doing a lot of best ball drafts right now, is a very stackable offense. You can get Sutton or Judy early, and if you get them, then you can obviously know to target Russ. But there's also options later now. Tim Patrick obviously has a season-ending injury, but KJ Hamler, hopefully he stays healthy, fingers crossed. And then Albert O also, at tight end. You can still group those guys together, if you do miss out on a Judy or Sutton, or if you only get one of those two guys. So I'm totally with you. I love Russ this year. Definitely one of my targets. Since you started with quarterback, I'm going to go to quarterback. I'm going to talk about another guy. This is more the Rich Hribar special, the guy who started the Konami code revolution back on Numberfire in like 2013, writing an article about why mobility at the quarterback position is a cheat code, talking about Terrell Pryor and Tim Tebow back then, who are no longer in the league. But one guy who I think just fits the mold perfectly, and it's sort of like, to me, especially in like home leagues, obviously in best ball leagues and probably sharper drafts, you're going to see this guy go a lot earlier. But in home leagues, and if you look at like aggregate ADP right now across bigger platforms, he's like QB 14, which is crazy to me. So he's like the quintessential go-to late round quarterback, in my opinion, this year. We've seen it happen with Patrick Mahomes a few years ago, Lamar Jackson a couple years ago, Jalen Hurts last year. This year's guy seems to be Trey Lance. If you look at what happened last year when he got his starts, he scored 14.6 and 19.1 fantasy points in those two games. And as a lot of you guys remember, unfortunately, he was an inch away from scoring that one rushing touchdown in that game, I think, against Arizona. So those numbers could have looked way, way better. But in those two games, he ran the ball 24 times. Not all of them were obviously designed, but he ran the ball a whole lot. And for some context, that's more rush attempts in those two, obviously a very small sample, but that's more rush attempts per game than what Lamar Jackson has averaged over his last 3 seasons. I'm not saying that that's the direction that Trey Lance is necessarily going to go. I'm just saying that there's a lot of juice from a volume perspective on the ground for Trey Lance in this offense. And speaking of this offense, the system's pretty good there in San Francisco. Not only do they have great weapons, Brandon Ayuk, I think, is going to get a little bit of a boost just from the standpoint of being able to get more vertical in the O. But they obviously have George Kittle and Deebo Samuel got extended, decent running backs back there. I think that they should be strong offensively, but the system is clearly good because Jimmy Garoppolo was second in the NFL last year in yards per attempt, and teams still don't really care about Jimmy Garoppolo across the league, despite the efficiency that he had last year. I think the downside that people see with Lance, there's this notion of like, they're questioning his arm, questioning if he's going to be a long-term answer at quarterback for them. Is he going to be good just as a passer, as a pure passer? And we don't have that answer yet. I think it's fine that we don't have that answer yet, but it's crazy because that's the reason why he's being drafted later, is because of this ambiguity. But here's my response to that. Look at Jalen Hurts last year. Literally last season, Jalen Hurts got everything done on the ground. I mean, he did have somewhat of an outlier season in terms of rushing touchdowns. Hurts did last year, but it's not like Hurts was lighting it up through the air. And he was still a very, very viable fantasy option week in and week out because of what he can do with his legs. And compared to Hurts, Lance has the situation, he has the draft capital, and he has the talent around him. So I think that his ceiling is even higher than what we saw from Jalen Hurts entering last season. So Trey Lance, I think, is the quintessential late round quarterback this year.
Yeah, and he's the Konami special this year. Like you said, there's a lot of overlap to what Jalen Hurts had. A lot of people thought, like, well, is he good enough to not get benched last year with Jalen Hurts? They brought in Gardner Minshew, remember, this time, right around this time, after they traded for him. And, we kind of still have that uneasiness. Well, Garoppolo's still on the roster. Well, we'll see if he makes it these next 3 weeks. I mean,
Yeah.
the thing about Lance is, versus Jalen Hurts, the guy was a top 3 pick. There's a lot of insulation here that they have to see this thing through. And to me, like you hit the nail on the head when you just talk about when you look at this situation compared to recent situations. It reminds me a lot like the Baltimore situation, Lamar Jackson, where you have this top-down infrastructure where that he's in good hands, right?
Yeah.
The way Baltimore handles things, and the talent here, the surrounding talent here is way better than Jalen Hurts had last year, and then what Lamar Jackson had as a passer in that 2019 breakout. With Deebo Samuel, with Brandon Ayuk, with George Kittle, with the running scheme that they have. And you look at last year, he only took 86 dropbacks, but only Taysom Hill, another Konami special, averaged more fantasy points per dropback than Trey Lance. He threw 2 fewer touchdown passes than Justin Fields did, who threw 200 more passes. He threw 4 fewer touchdown passes than Zach Wilson, who threw 142 more passes than him too. So there is like a floor and upside here with Trey Lance. He's just right there at that palatable ADP. And someone in your home league is going to be like, no, he's not a good quarterback. I'm not going to take him.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of people, and there are a lot of people out there who are hesitant to put Trey Lance in their top 10 even at the quarterback position when really the mobility factor is more about a floor thing than a ceiling thing. The ceiling really comes for these guys when their arm connects, right? And that's what we saw with Lamar Jackson a couple of years ago when he had that MVP season. He was the QB1, one of the best quarterback seasons we ever seen in fantasy football. It was because he had a crazy season with his arm in terms of touchdown rate and the things that he was able to do, with his weapons there. So that's really where the upside comes into play. The floor is very, very safe with a guy like Lance just because of that mobility. So keep that in mind as well. All right, Rich, second guy, let's hear it.
My second guy is Dalvin Cook. He's really kind of fallen to like that back of the round 1 this season, after being kind of like a disappointment. He was basically the consensus pick 2 last year. And he still had almost 1,400 yards last season. But, you look at last year, he's 5th in the league still in touches per game. Everyone wants to talk about what Kevin O'Connell brings playing a lot more 11 personnel with the Rams over to the Minnesota Vikings. And they talk about it in the context of like, well, KJ Osborne now is going to be a full-time player. But look at what it's going to do for Dalvin Cook. He's now going to get a run out of a lot more 11 personnel. And the offensive line's not good, but it's going to help alleviate, box counts and make this offensive line a little bit better. Since he entered the NFL, he's 29th among all running backs in carries out of 11 personnel. Just 27.5% of his carries are from 11 personnel. But his efficiency when having more wideouts on the field and seeing, subsequent lighter boxes just absolutely smashes for an already efficient player. He ranks 7th in career yards per carry from 11 personnel, just under 5.5 yards. That's like Nick Chubb levels of production. He's 4th in EPA per run out of 11 personnel. The past 3 years, a more recent sample, he's 5th, 7th, and 1st in EPA per rush out of 11 personnel. Then when you look at what we could see some creativity, for Dalvin Cook, we seen last year, Darrell Henderson run 104 pass routes in the slot and out wide. Sony Michel, another 79. Those two guys, 183 combined, if you're going to do the math on that. Dalvin Cook, 35 pass routes lined up out wide or outside last season. So that's how you take a guy like Dalvin Cook, who's coming off of a career low receiving season, just 2.6 receptions per game, 6.6 yards per catch, and kind of boost that up while he's going to get more efficient runs there as well. Then when you look at it from like a top-down perspective, because I know you like this kind of stuff, doing, projections. The Vikings were 2nd in the NFL in rate of passing touchdowns. 77% of their passing touchdowns on offense came through the air. Historically, teams over 75% of their touchdowns come via passing. 80% of those teams see an increase in rushing scores the next season, with an average spike of 6 touchdowns on the ground per those teams. And Dalvin Cook himself is just, due natural regression. He scored in just 10.9% of his red zone opportunities. His career rate prior to that was 21.3%. He converted just 3 of 12 carries inside the 5-yard line. His career rate is 44% higher. And then as a cherry on top, Minnesota has our top-ranked rushing schedule for the season. So I think Dalvin Cook should be the RB4 after, Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler. And you can typically get him, 107, 108 much later. So I'm looking for a big bounce back.
I'm 100% with you. I have him in the exact same spot in my rankings. I'm taking him over a guy like Derrick Henry, especially in non-standard leagues. So I'm with you. I'm very bullish on the Minnesota offense just in general this year. I think there's a lot of fireworks that can be had. I'm going to go from one running back who's being drafted early in Dalvin Cook to one that's being drafted in the middle rounds who is kind of polarizing. It's sort of a play on words there. It's Tony Pollard. That was pretty bad. That was bad. So here's the thing with Tony Pollard. I have not been on this guy in redraft until this year, and I feel like
very un-JJ player.
Yeah, it's a very un-JJ player, but I feel like people who, people listen to analysts who like Pollard, they assume that they have been on Pollard, this entire time, that they're one of those guys that's like, oh, Tony Pollard's so much better than Ezekiel Elliott, and he's got to be on the field over Zeke, and Zeke is done, and blah, blah, blah. I don't really feel that way. I actually think that Zeke is fine where he's being drafted, but I also think that Tony Pollard is just a really good value where he's being drafted as well, because I'm thinking in range of outcomes here. I'm thinking in terms of what happens if Ezekiel Elliott does indeed get hurt. And so, whenever you look at where Tony Pollard is getting drafted right now, Fantasy Pros half PPR ADP has him at RB32. When I look at my projections, that's actually a little bit below my projections where I have him overall. So basically, let's just say that he's being drafted at his projection, right? Which is fine. Like I think that we see that a lot with a lot of guys, especially in the middle rounds. But the difference between those players and someone like Tony Pollard, let's just look at like Tony Pollard versus Hunter Renfrow or a lot of other wide receivers that just go sort of in the middle rounds. The difference is that he has insane upside if something happens to a guy sitting in front of him on that depth chart, Ezekiel Elliott. If Ezekiel Elliott goes down, if we were to walk into the season and assume that Zeke wasn't going to play and that Tony Pollard was the team's RB1, he'd be a second round pick in fantasy. He might even be a late first to some people because people love Tony Pollard. And so we know that the upside at least is there for Pollard if something were to happen to Zeke. But at the very least, you're drafting him at projection. You're drafting him, where he could still retain value and be fine enough, sort of as like a flex play, maybe even as an RB2 in a full PPR league and in more of like a hero RB or zero RB type build. But I talked about this also in the breakout running back episode that I did. But team RB2s by ADP who have team RB1s that get drafted in the dead zone, which is where Zeke has been going for the most part. Those guys have been unbelievable bets to make. The easy go-to is when Austin Eckler was in that range with Melvin Gordon, when Melvin Gordon was suspended for the first 4 games of the season, or was holding out, I should say. He was not suspended. It was during his holdout. And then there's also Tariq Cohen during his big breakout year. He was a middle round pick when Jordan Howard was going in the dead zone. Because you have these guys in the dead zone that just don't have necessarily this full profile, but these RB2s are talented. I mean, Tony Pollard is a talented running back, no matter really how you look at it. And obviously, he's a pass catcher, which is another great thing that we look for in breakout running backs. And then on top of that, he's also not past his 5th year in the league, which is another really big milestone for middle round running backs in terms of just general hit rate. So I do think that there's an absolute chance that Tony Pollard is just more of like a high-end RB3 this year. Like that's his probable outcome, if we're being honest, is like low-end RB2, high-end RB3, PPR, full PPR, maybe give him a little bit of a bump if they really do use him more in the slot and more at receiver, which I do think that they will end up doing almost by necessity at this point because there's really not much else there. But the upside is just so crazy if something were to happen to Zeke. So I think taking that chance in the middle round just makes a ton of sense in formats, especially where you're getting some points per reception.
Yeah, and you brought up a player that when I look at this situation, Austin Eckler, and you're looking for a situation like that. And also if you just follow Pollard, the trajectory of his career, I mean, more touches every NFL season, yards per touch go through the roof. Dallas averaged just under 7 yards per play when he was in the field last year, which would have by far led the NFL. You talked about their passing game situation of all the players they lost. He has an inline to be used there. No running back was targeted at a higher rate per route run when split out in the slot or out wide than Tony Pollard last season. Now, a lot of those targets are still behind line of scrimmage or quick hitters and screens like that. Sure. But that shows that he's a guy that they value getting out in space. I mean, Dallas should totally, when you look at this thing from a top-down perspective, especially given their roster, this should be a Melvin Gordon, Austin Eckler situation or an A.J. Dillon, Aaron Jones situation. Like, that's how they should use these backs in unison. They're also going to maximize Ezekiel Elliott using these guys this way too. And then you brought up the contingent value. It's one thing to say, all right, I'm not going to take Tony Pollard because, all right, I'm drafting basically a floor-based player, but I mean, the contingent value is through the roof if anything were to happen to Ezekiel Elliott. We've only seen him play one game without Ezekiel Elliott, and he was the RB1 in weekly scoring. And that was on a team that, Andy Dalton was quarterbacking as well. So definitely a lot of contingent upside there while you're getting a player that already had 10 weeks as an RB3 or better last year and 7 as an RB2 or better. So, yeah, I like that a lot.
All right, Rich, let's hear your third.
My third is probably going to get some eye rolls, but I mean, a lot of fantasy analysts like this guy, and it's Allen Robinson. I know another guy that hurt a lot of people last year, right? And this is how you play fantasy football. I mean, listen, man, you strike when people are living on that recency bias. That's right. Everything was a disaster for Allen Robinson last year. I can't sugarcoat. The dude had COVID. He had an ankle injury. He had a hamstring injury. He had a Matt Nagy injury. He played at Justin Fields. He seemingly just didn't even want to be in Chicago. So all of that, and I don't want to give him a hall pass either. But he's going from a guy that now has 80% of his career targets from Blake Bortles and Mitchell Trubisky to playing with unequivocally the best quarterback of his career. Papa's he's watching this Matthew Stafford news, though. We're going to keep an eye on this Matthew Stafford elbow stuff throughout camp, though. But if you look at the Rams historically, they have one of the best medical staffs in all of the NFL, especially when you look at their injured player rate the past 2 years. I mean, they're running a tight ship there. So I have a little bit of faith. But when you look at how Robinson was impacted last year from the Matt Nagy angle, 40% of his routes last season were just slants and curls. I mean, the Bears built the whole offense on the slants and curls. If you look at Mooney, too, that's how they used him. It was just an absolute joke. 40% of his routes came on those two routes, and those routes created just a 5.9 ADOT, average depth of target, which played a large role into just the disaster of the season he had. 21% of all the routes the Rams ran as an offense last year were just slants and curls. So big time difference in terms of offense. No team had more air yards last season on digs, post, go, and deep crossing routes than the Rams. They had almost 1,000 more yards than the Bears on those routes, who were dead last in the NFL on air yards on those routes. He's going from a system now that's going to give him a lot of fantasy rich types of targets, even though he's probably not going to push, being a 140 target player again. You look at his terms of in the paint. We saw Odell Beckham score those touchdowns the back half of last season. The Rams were second in the NFL in pass rate inside the 10. They led the NFL in pass rate inside the 5. And then also another player like Tony Pollard, there's massive contingent value here with Allen Robinson. If anything were to happen to Cooper Kupp, Ben Skowronek, Van Jefferson, these are the names that are next in line in a system that we believe in, a quarterback that we believe in. So, I mean, I think Allen Robinson he's actually being drafted, I think, below his floor right now. And then it's massive upside.
Yeah, I'm with you on Robinson, man. This has been someone that you and I have talked about a lot this offseason. When we first built projections, he sort of popped. Him and Michael Pittman were two guys who just looked really good in projections whenever, first run through. I agree, though. I mean, if you look at Sean McVay's offenses since he's got to LA, his offenses, his wide receiver 2, which granted, they've had pretty good wide receiver 2s in there, whether it was Brandon Cooks or Robert Woods. I mean, good players have been there, but those wide receiver 2s, in terms of adjusted target share, so it's really just target share per game times the number of games in that season, so 16 or 17, this past year, the lowest that they've had by their wide receiver 2 has been 21%. So if you got a 21% target share from Allen Robinson in this offense, I think that you would easily be drafting him in the 4th round, where he's been going in a lot of more casual leagues and these bigger platforms like an ESPN or a Yahoo. You're going to be able to get Allen Robinson in the 6th round in some of your home leagues this year.
Oh, the general population leagues, you're going to take him, and the immediately dude's I had that dude last year.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's the recency bias thing. It's the he burned me so bad last year thing, and he did. He was probably the worst early round pick last year of a guy who didn't really get hurt in the traditional way. I mean, he was just a really, really bad pick last year. But there's a lot of reason to be bullish on him and that situation in general. I'll go from one wide receiver to another. Let's go to Drake London. I'm really, really into London, obviously as a prospect. I mean, he was a 98th to 99th percentile prospect in my model. Players with that high of a rating give us an 18 plus PPR point per game season across their first 3 at a 35% clip since 2011, which is 18 plus is a top 6 season at wide receiver, and they're hitting that at about a 35% rate. Now, granted, that's the first 3 years in the league. I'm just showing and explaining that to show you that he's a very good player and he's with very, very good company overall within this model. But the other thing too, and one of the reasons to be pretty bullish on London if you look, and I've talked about this on the breakout wide receiver episode, I talked about this in the draft guide as well, but top 100 redraft rookie wide receivers have been unbelievable bets historically. So when we're talking top 100 players, and especially rookie wide receivers, we're talking like the best of the best wide receivers that get drafted in the actual NFL draft. We're talking like Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, like these top 10 guys, which is what Drake London obviously was. But 79% of those players that have been drafted in the top 100 overall in fantasy drafts as a rookie wide receiver have exceeded ADP expectation just by more than zero. So they've just been better than ADP expectation since 2011. That's a 79% rate. And then on top of that, they've become breakouts where they're exceeding ADP expectation by 3 or more points or 6 or more points at a really, really good rate too. Way better rate than what we see generally from middle round wide receivers. Drake London, he's locked into that spot, obviously, like I said, as a top 100 player after going so high in the NFL draft and being the top wide receiver off the board. I think right now you sort of look at the rookie wide receiver landscape, and there's some guys that in home leagues and stuff you could see Treylon Burks getting in there and Chris Olave getting in there and some players like that, but they're not as much of a lock as Drake London is in terms of just being a top 100 pick. There's a lack of competition in Atlanta. Obviously, target share is earned, but Drake London is, aside from Kyle Pitts, easily the most talented. He's at least the most talented wide receiver that they have, with like Zacchaeus there and Auden Tate there and Bryan Edwards there. Just a lot of guys who haven't really gotten it done historically. He might not completely blow up this year, but guys with his profile, and I understand that people are a little bit turned off by rookie wide receivers in redraft, but rookie wide receivers in redraft have been unbelievable values compared to the market historically, so I'm going to buy into Drake London.
Yeah, you look at Atlanta's wide receiver layout. I mean, Damiere Byrd is the most career receiving yards currently on the roster. I think that's going to be no hurdle for him to really kind of push the target tree. The other thing you like about London, and I think London and Burks in particular this season, is that we don't see big guys like them like kind of work the way they did in college. They could win, downfield as well, but like both of those guys got so many targets on screens and produced after the catch, and it kind of alleviates some of the concerns you might have like a little bit about the situation in terms and like the last 2 years. I mean, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase have kind of like really blown this thing up, but you seem like that hasn't really impacted ADP for any of these guys either. Like, it's not like London's going like wide receiver 20, right? Like, it hasn't ruined it. Like, those two guys, the explosions they've had haven't ruined the bag that take upside. You can easily get London in a wide receiver heavy build as your wide receiver 4+ or your wide receiver 3+, with going aggressively with running backs early. So he fits basically all structures, like a lot of these rookie wide receivers do.
Yeah, I think you have another rookie wide receiver that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, one of the guys like I've been frequently just grabbing is Chris Olave. I mean, he's a guy that was just an absolute touchdown machine at Ohio State. He actually set the career, record for receiving touchdowns at Ohio State. Now, granted, he was, one of those, 4-year players. They usually push him out, before Ohio State usually pushes those guys out pro, like Garrett Wilson. But he bet on himself. I mean, by all counts, last year he was told he was going to be a 2nd-round pick, and he bet on himself. And guess what? He got that bag. We went 12 overall. He's 2nd in this class in converting contested catches. At 63%. He's got a great physical profile. Like a lot of these other guys in this draft class. 190 pounds, under 4.40. But then you also look at like where he went. And you look at what the Saints did last year. They were just an uninspiring, aggressive offense. But you ask why this happened, and it's because while Jameis Winston was the quarterback, his leading target was Alvin Kamara, 34 targets. And he targeted Marcus Callaway was his next highest target, and no other player had more than 16 targets. There's a reason like the Saints ate out what it was outside of the structure of scheme. It's because they were throwing to just vagabonds. Now you look at this system, they've got Michael Thomas on the field. They had Jarvis Landry, you got Chris Olave. There is an opportunity here now for this team to be a lot more aggressive offensively. We know Jameis will be willing to be aggressive. And we saw that Jameis, when he did want to push the ball downfield last year to a guy like Deontay Hardy, he was hyper efficient. So I look at Olave in context this offense, these wide receivers, and there is target competition here more so than a guy like Drake London. But he does something different than what Jarvis Landry and what Michael Thomas provide for the offense. And then another guy that has baked in contingent upside. So he can easily just walk into having a solid target share because of the investment and the talent level. And then if Michael Thomas isn't fully 100%, Jarvis Landry has been a player that's been declining the last 2 years. There's a definite like path for him to even have a lot more on an offense that I believe is just significantly undervalued. I think the Saints are an undervalued fantasy team in general.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, man. And as you know, and as a lot of listeners know, Olave ranks second in my prospect model at wide receiver this year in a really, really good wide receiver class. I did rank him third in my rookie rankings behind Burks also, just because I think Burks' build and such is just the ceiling's a little bit higher. But Olave, Matt Harmon with reception perception saw him as the best route runner in this class as well. I just think there's a lot to like about Olave, and pairing him up with Jameis right away could be a lot of fun. Speaking of fun wide receivers, I got another guy, Kadarius Toney, another player who 3 or 4 years ago I feel like I wouldn't be as in on as I am now. It's just that my process has been refined a little bit, and I'm looking for these guys a little bit more. But with Toney last year, there was a lot to like about what he did on the field. He averaged a target share per game of 20.7%. In games where he had 50% or more of the team's snaps last year. The only 50-plus target players who saw more targets per route run last year were Antonio Brown, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, and A.J. Brown than Kadarius Toney. 10 rookie wide receivers who have had 50 or more targets and a yards per route run rate of 1.7 or more and a 50% slot snap rate since 2011. The other 9 players are Cooper Kupp, Jarvis Landry, CeeDee Lamb, Doug Baldwin, Jordan Matthews, who, he was fine for the first few years of his career, Juju Smith-Schuster, Hunter Renfrow, Jalen Waddle, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Kadarius Toney. And obviously I mentioned Jalen Waddle and Amon-Ra St. Brown there, but those guys are going a lot earlier than where Kadarius Toney is generally going in drafts. Toney last year was second since 2011 among rookie wide receivers in targets per route run. The guy who was in first, this guy named Tyreek Hill, he's a pretty good football player. He's a second-year player. That's what we should be targeting, especially in the middle rounds. We've seen second-year wide receivers in those middle rounds exceed ADP expectation by 3+ points per game at a 42% clip since 2011, which is by far the best subset. I mean, the average among middle round wide receivers is about 24%, exceeding ADP expectation by 3+ points. Second-year wide receivers, it's 42%. So you're getting a demographic that you like to target. You're getting a guy who is obscenely efficient and really with a lot of good players historically that have done the things that Kadarius Toney did last year. Yes, it's a smaller sample. We would have liked to see him play a little bit more last season, but at the same time, it was in a pretty poor situation as well. So my thinking with this is if this offense clicks with Dable, which it's going to be better than what it's been the last 2 years. It's almost impossible for the Giants offense to be worse than it has been the last couple of years. But if things do click with Dable, I think Toney's going to play a little bit more on the outside this year too with Wan'Dale Robinson in the slot. But those 3 guys that they have are all pretty good complementary pieces, I think. And I think Toney could just be the guy that they rely on most within this offense.
Yeah, he's been a guy that I've been above market on, pretty continuously. He's getting a push now. Especially now we got some camp clips of him winning outside, and people love that. But you hit the nail on the head. Like, I just really want to invest in as many of these year 2 wide receivers as possible. I mean, we have that grouping of Bateman, Amon-Ra, Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, Kadarius Toney, all go as wide receiver 3+. Toney has the lowest ADP of those guys. Rondale Moore also is a little bit further down. He takes a little bit more step of faith, but add him to at his cost too.
Yeah.
But that's really I want to leave every draft with at least 2 of those guys. And where you can get them in drafts. And it doesn't always happen in kind of our drafts, but I mean the way that it's spread out, those guys are just kind of, like you said, it's a subset of guys to bet on. Be aggressive with those guys. Get as many of those guys in your roster. Hopefully you get the breakouts. But that grouping of receivers is by far the most exciting tier of wide receivers that I am excited for in drafts this year.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. And you don't usually see this many second-year wide receivers in the middle rounds the way that we're seeing. It's credit to how good last year's draft class was at wide receiver. And the other thing, too, I know that a lot of these guys, even Kadarius Toney to some degree, but Elijah Moore is one, Amon-Ra St. Brown's another, even Rashad Bateman to some degree. You're going to look at it and say, I don't like their situation. I don't want to draft them for their situation. But at the wide receiver position especially, you got to be drafting for talent, and you got to be drafting for the profile, and a lot of those second-year wide receivers check a lot of boxes. So, all right, we have tight ends to talk about. You have one and I have one. Why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm still going to the big chief, David Njoku. This year especially, I feel like I'm not a huge early tight end guy anyways, but I feel like this year especially, it's very suspect at the top. I think that as good as that tier is on a talent level, there's a lot of red flags in all of the top tier of tight ends. I mean, you've got Kelsey. He's 33 years old. If he were to be the tight end one, he'd be the oldest tight end in NFL history for fantasy football. You've got Darren Waller now. How much does he share with, Devontae Adams? How much does that impact him? Kyle Pitts potentially playing on the worst offense in the NFL. George Kittle has to deal with Trey Lance, and he's already been a volatile player. And then Mark Andrews with like his 32 points of regression that people have brought up all offseason. I don't think any of those guys are bad players. And if any of those guys fall a little bit lower than ADP, I'm definitely interested in them. But I do think that there are some red flags here. So I'm not going to get invested into that tier. We know that like the typical tight end dead zone exists. Do I really want to jump in and grab guys like Dalton Schultz and Zach Ertz? Like those guys are uninspiring as well. So if we're going to go to these like later round tight ends, what do we want? We want a guy that still is on the age spectrum for a breakout. David Njoku just turned 26 years old. Can he compete to be a lead target on his team? Absolutely. I mean, we really only have Amari Cooper in the way. The rest of the Browns depth chart is wide open. I mean, you've got David Bell, you've got Donovan Peoples-Jones, you've got Anthony Schwartz. It's wide open. He's coming off a career high 13.2 yards per catch, 9 yards per target. He only played 64% of the offensive snaps last year. He only ran 305 pass routes, which was fewer than Foster Moreau. Those are going to just massively expand now that he's a guy that has secured that bag from the organization. Austin Hooper's out of there. We don't still really know if Deshaun Watson's going to play. Obviously, if Deshaun Watson played, it'd be a massive upgrade. But even if Jacoby Brissett is the quarterback, I love this for David Njoku. I mean, only Lamar Jackson and Carson Wentz have targeted tight ends at a higher rate so far over their careers than Jacoby Brissett. It's a tight end friendly system. And if Deshaun Watson doesn't play, it's only going to put the Browns in a situation where they are probably going to be losing more games than they would have been. So, I mean, where he's going in terms of draft costs, he's just a guy I think that just fits a lot of team builds. He fits as your tight end 2 in these builds, as an upside swing in best ball leagues. And then also if you're just downright find yourself having to punt the position, I think the opportunity is there for him to take a shot on, because if you fail, you're just going to be doing what half of your league is going to be doing and chasing the tight end position.
I'm very much in on Njoku. He's actually one of the players to target in the draft guide. You look at the system too, as you mentioned, the system hasn't had like unbelievable tight ends. Austin Hooper's fine, but it hasn't with Stefanski. They haven't had these like unreal tight end talents. But despite that, in a run heavy scheme, they've been 7th in the NFL in tight end targets over the last 2 years. So it's definitely a scheme that should be favorable for Njoku. And then you nailed it with the rest of his profile, and that Brissett nugget is a great one as well. I will go from Njoku to Cole Kmet. Cole Kmet's just like sort of like just a safer option, I think, at this point. I don't know if he has true like top 3 tight end, a top 3 tight end season in him, but at the very least, I do think he's probably the safest later round tight end that you can find this year. Last year on 93 targets, he didn't score a touchdown. He was the first tight end since 2011 with more than 85 targets to not score a touchdown. You got to hope that like that new offensive scheme and Justin Fields being a sophomore instead of a freshman is going to help things out there a little bit. Jimmy Graham's gone. The only other established pass catcher in this offense is Darnell Mooney. So I think that from a projection standpoint, you could project pretty comfortably Cole Kmet getting into that like 18-19% target share range, which means he's not that far away from a 20% share, which isn't that shocking. I mean, they don't have anything else to really throw to in that offense right now. And when you look at the 67 tight ends since 2011 who played 8 or more games with an adjusted target share of at least 20%, so that's a per game target share, 63 of the 67 ended up scoring double-digit PPR points per game. And I know that sounds like a very low number, and it is. Double-digit points per game in PPR leagues is not a lot of points, but at the tight end position, that alone is a low-end tight end 1 season because the tight end position is so bad, which means Cole Kmet is effectively being drafted around his floor right now, I think. I mean, realistically, just given the fact that he should walk in to a target share like that. I don't know if his ceiling is obscene. I don't know if he's going to really get there, but if you're going to be drafting some other tight ends based on volume and situation, I think I would just wait a little bit more and just get Cole Kmet instead, who can give you a similar-ish season.
Yeah, I think when you look at it from a range of outcomes perspective, when I look at Cole Kmet, he looks like very much arbitrage on the median and floor outcomes for guys like Dalton Schultz and TJ Hawkinson and maybe even Zach Ertz, because you're probably not going to get like a super amount of touchdowns here from this Bears offense. But in these full PPR leagues and these tight end premium leagues, the targets and the kind of like safe floor you're going to get out of these catches are definitely there. Maybe run hot and some touchdowns. We don't know. The ghost of Jimmy Graham, like you said, is gone. He had 8 red zone targets and 6 end zone targets as well. Is there. And then when you just look at Kmet too, we look at the tight end spectrum, right? Like we know it's a slow burn process. This guy was a round 2 draft pick. He's still young, and you should be kind of encouraged in year 2 earning 93 targets, and then getting more playing time across the board. Like that should be an encouraging thing. I mean, I think there's even some like low key, like not to circle back to the Saints thing, but like Adam Troutman's like being left for dead. But like in year 2, he played 80% of the snaps, and like we know it's a slow burn position. The Saints traded like their entire draft that year to trade back up for Troutman. We know it's a slow burn. Like don't forget about these guys just because as you know, year 1, year 2, they didn't really pop, because we inherently know it takes a little bit for these tight ends to get going.
Yep, and that's one of the reasons why they emerge every single year in fantasy football, where we get these very, very late tight ends who no one was talking about, no one was in on, who end up being lower-end tight end ones. But Rich, appreciate your time as always. Thanks for hopping on and dropping some knowledge. For anyone not following Rich and his work, head to Twitter, follow him at Lord Reebs. That's Lord REEBS, and make sure you check out everything going on at sharpfootballanalysis.com. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Remember to head to lateround.com to purchase this year's Late Round Draft Guide, join the Patreon, subscribe to the free newsletter, all that good stuff. I'll talk to you later in the week.